Chapter 9, Section 2 of The History of Mr. Polly by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 9, Section 2. Mr. Polly was particularly charmed by the ducklings. They were piping about among the vegetables in the company of their foster mother, and as he and the plump woman came down the garden path, the little creatures mobbed them, and ran over their boots and in between Mr. Polly's legs, and did their best to be trodden down and killed, after the manner of ducklings all the world over. Mr. Polly had never been near young ducklings before, and their extreme blondness and the delicate completeness of their feet and beaks filled him with admiration. It is open to question whether there is anything more friendly in the world than a very young duckling. It was with the utmost difficulty that he tore himself away to practise punting, with the plump woman coaching from the bank. Punting, he found, was difficult, but not impossible, and towards 4 o'clock he succeeded in conveying a second passenger across the sundering flood from the inn to the unknown. As he returned, slowly indeed, but now one might say surely, to the peg to which the punt was moored, he became aware of a singularly delightful human being awaiting him on the bank. She stood with her legs very wide apart, her hands behind her back, and her head a little on one side, watching his gestures with an expression of disdainful interest. She had black hair and brown legs, and a buff short frock, and very intelligent eyes, and when he reached a sufficient proximity she remarked, "Hello." "Hello," said Mr. Polly, and saved himself in the nick of time from disaster. "Silly," said the young lady, and Mr. Polly lunged nearer. "What are you called?" "Polly." "Liar." "Why?" "I'm Polly." "Then I'm Alfred, but I meant to be Polly." "I was first." "All right, I'm going to be the ferryman." "I see. You'll have to punt better." "You should have seen me earlier in the afternoon." "I can imagine it. I've seen the others." "What others?" Mr. Polly had now landed and was fastening up the punt. "Wham has scooted." "Scooted?" "He conies and scoots them. He'll scoot you too, I expect." A mysterious shadow seemed to fall athwart the sunshine and pleasantness of the Potwell Inn. "I'm not a scooter," said Mr. Polly. "Uncle Jim is." She whistled a little flatly for a moment and threw small stones at a clump of meadowsweet that sprang from the bank. Then she remarked, "When Uncle Jim comes back he'll cut your insides out. Perhaps, very likely, he'll let me see." There was a pause. "Who's Uncle Jim?" Mr. Polly asked in a faded voice. "Don't you know who Uncle Jim is? He'll show you. He's a scorcher, is Uncle Jim. He only came back just a little time ago, and he scooted 3 men. He don't like strangers about, don't Uncle Jim. He can swear. He's going to teach me, soon as I can whistle properly." "Teach you to swear?" cried Mr. Polly, horrified. "And spit," said the little girl proudly. "He says I'm the gamest little beast he ever came across, ever." For the first time in his life it seemed to Mr. Polly that he had come across something sheerly dreadful. He stared at the pretty thing of flesh and spirit in front of him, lightly balanced on its stout little legs, and looking at him with eyes that had still to learn the expression of either disgust or fear. "I say," said Mr. Polly, "how old are you?" "9," said the little girl. She turned away and reflected. Truth compelled her to add one statement.
He's not what I should call handsome, not Uncle Jim," she said, "but he's a scorcher and no mistake. Grandma don't like him."
Mr. Polly found the plump woman in the big bricked kitchen lighting a fire for tea. He went to the root of the matter at once. "I say," he asked, "who's Uncle Jim?" The plump woman blanched and stood still for a moment. A stick fell out of the bundle in her hand unheeded.
"That little granddaughter of mine been saying things?" she asked faintly.
Bits of things," said Mr. Polly.
"Well, I suppose I must tell you sooner or later. It's Jim. He's the drawback to this place, that's what he is, the drawback. I hoped you mightn't hear so soon. Very likely he's gone."
"She don't seem to think so."
"He hasn't been near the place these 2 weeks and more," said the plump woman.
"But who is he?"
"I suppose I've got to tell you," said the plump woman.
"She says he scoots people," Mr. Polly remarked after a pause.
"He's my sister's own son."
The plump woman watched the crackling fire for a space.
"I suppose I got to tell you," she repeated.
She softened towards tears.
"I try not to think of it, and day and night he's haunting me. I try not to think of it. I've been easy going my whole life, but I'm that worried and afraid, with death and ruin threatened and evil all about me. I don't know what to do. My own sister's son, and me a widow woman, and helpless against his doings."
She put down the sticks he held upon the fender and felt for her handkerchief. She began to sob and talk quickly.
"I wouldn't mind nothing else half so much if he'd leave that child alone, but he goes talking to her. If I leave her a moment he's talking to her, teaching her words and giving her ideas."
"That's a bit thick," said Mr. Polly.
"Thick?" cried the plump woman. "It's horrible. And what am I to do? He's been here 3 times now, 6 days and a week and part of a week, and I pray to God night and day he may never come back again. Praying, oh, back he's come sure as fate. He takes my money and he takes my things. He won't let no man stay here to protect me or do the boats or work the ferry. The ferry's getting a scandal. They stand and shout and scream and use language. Oh, if I complain they'll say I'm helpless to manage here. They'll take away my licence and out I shall go, and it's all the living I can get, and he knows it, and he plays on it, and he don't care. And here I am. I'd send the child away, but I got nowhere to send the child. I buys him off when it comes to that, and back he comes, worse than ever, prowling about and doing evil. And not a soul to help me, not a soul. I just hoped there might be a day or 2 before he comes back again. I was just hoping. I'm the sort that hopes."
Mr. Polly was reflecting on the flaws and drawbacks that seemed to be inseparable from all the more agreeable things in life. Biggish sort of man, I expect?" asked Mr. Polly, trying to get the situation in all its bearings. But the plump woman did not heed him. She was going on with her fire making and retelling in disconnected fragments the fearfulness of Uncle Jim.
"There was always something a bit wrong with him," she said, "but nothing you might have hoped for. Not till they took him and carried him off and reformed him. He was cruel to the hens and chickens, it's true, and stuck a knife into another boy, but then I've seen him that nice to a cat. Nobody could have been kinder. I'm sure he didn't do no harm to that cat, what anybody ever tries to make out of it. I never listened to that. It was the reformatory that ruined him. They put him along of a lot of London boys, full of ideas of wickedness, and because he didn't mind pain, and he don't, I'll admit, try as I would, that made him think himself a hero. Them boys laughed at the teachers they set above them, laughed and mocked at them, and I don't suppose they was the best teachers in the world. I don't suppose, and I don't suppose anyone sensible does suppose, that anyone who goes to be a teacher or a chaplain or a warder in a reformatory home goes and changes right away into an angel of grace from heaven, and... Oh Lord, where was I?
What did they send him to the reformatory for?
Playing truant and stealing. He stole right enough. Stole the money from an old woman. And what was I to do when it came to the trial but say what I knew? And him like a viper a-looking at me. More like a viper than a human boy. He leans on the bar and looks at me. "All right, Aunt Flo," he says. Just that and nothing more. Time after time I've dreamed of it. And now he's come. "They've reformed me," he says, "and made me a devil, and devil I mean to be to you. So out with it," he says.
"What did you give him last time?" asked Mr. Polly.
"3 golden pounds,"
said the plump woman.
"That won't last very long," he says, "but there ain't no hurry. I'll be back in a week about. If I wasn't one of the hoping sort."
She left the sentence unfinished. Mr. Polly reflected. "What sort of a size is he?" he asked. "I'm not one of your Herculaneous sort, if you meant that. Nothing very wonderful biceptually."
"You will scoot,"
said the plump woman with conviction rather than bitterness.
"You'd better scoot now, and I'll try and find some money for him to go away with when he comes. It ain't reasonable to expect you to do anything but scoot. But I suppose it's the way of a woman in trouble to try to get help from a man, and hope. I'm the hoping sort."
"How long's he been about?" asked Mr. Polly, ignoring his own outlook.
"Oh, 3 months it is come the 7th since he come in by that back door, and I ain't seen eyes on him for 7 long years. He stood in the door watching me, and suddenly he let off a yelp like a dog, and there he was grinning at the fright he'd given me. 'Good old Auntie Flo,' he says. 'Ain't you delighted to see me?' he says, 'now I'm reformed.'"
The plump lady went to the sink and filled the kettle.
"I never did like him,"
she said, standing at the sink.
"And seeing him there, with his teeth all black and broken, perhaps I didn't give him much of a welcome at first, not what would have been kind to him. 'Lord,' I said, 'it's Jim.' 'It's Jim,' he said, 'like a bad shilling, like a damned bad shilling, Jim and trouble. You all of you wanted me reformed, and now you got me reformed. I'm a reformatory reformed character, warranted all right, and turned out as such. Ain't you going to ask me in, Auntie dear? Come in,' I said. I won't have it said I wasn't ready to be kind to you. He comes in and shuts the door. Down he sits in that chair. 'I come to torment you,' he says, 'you old something,' and begins at me. No human being could have ever been called such things before. It made me cry out. And now,' he says, 'just to show I ain't afraid of hurting you,' he says, and ups and twists my wrist."
Mr. Polly gasped.
"I could stand even his violence," said the plump woman, "if it wasn't for the child."
Mr. Polly went to the kitchen window and surveyed his namesake, who was away up the garden path with her hands behind her back, and wisps of black hair in disorder about her little face, thinking profoundly about ducklings. "You two oughtn't be left," he said. The plump woman stared at his back with hard hope in her eyes. "I don't see that it's my affair," said Mr. Polly. The plump woman resumed her business with the kettle. "I'd like to have a look at him before I go," said Mr. Polly, thinking aloud, and added, "somehow. Not my business, of course." "Lord!" he cried with a start at a noise in the bar. "Who's that?" "Only a customer," said the plump woman. Mr. Polly made no rash promises and thought a great deal. "It seems a good sort of crib," he said, and added, "for a chap who's looking for trouble." But he stayed on and did various things out of the list I have already given, and worked the ferry, and it was 4 days before he saw anything of Uncle Jim. And so resistant is the human mind to things not yet experienced, that he could easily have believed in that time that there was no such person in the world as Uncle Jim. The plump woman, after her one outbreak of confidence, ignored the subject, and little Polly seemed to have exhausted her impressions in her first communication, and engaged her mind now with a simple directness in the study and subjugation of the new human being Heaven had sent into her world. The first unfavourable impression of his punting was soon effaced. He could nickname ducklings very amusingly, create boats out of wooden splinters, and stalk and fly from imaginary tigers in the orchard with a convincing earnestness that was surely beyond the power of any other human being. She conceded at last that he should be called Mr. Polly in honour of her, Miss Polly, even as he desired. Uncle Jim turned up in the twilight. Uncle Jim appeared with none of the disruptive violence Mr. Polly had dreaded. He came quite softly. Mr. Polly was going down the lane behind the church that led to the Potwell Inn after posting a letter to the lime juice people at the post office. He was walking slowly after his habit and thinking discursively. With a sudden tightening of the muscles he became aware of a figure walking noiselessly beside him. His first impression was of a face singularly broad above and with a wide empty grin as its chief feature below, of a slouching body and dragging feet. "'Arf a mo'," said the figure as if in response to his start, and speaking in a hoarse whisper. "'Arf a mo', mister. You the new bloke at the Potwell Inn?" Mr. Polly felt evasive. "Suppose I am," he replied hoarsely, and quickened his pace. "'Arf a mo'," said Uncle Jim, taking his arm. "We ain't doing a," sanguinary, "marathon. It ain't a," decorated, "cinder track. I want a word with you, mister. See?" Mr. Polly wriggled his arm free and stopped. "What is it?" he asked, and faced the terror. "I just want a," decorated, "word with you. See? Just a friendly word or two. Just to clear up any blooming errors. That's all I want. No need to be so," richly decorated, "proud. If you are the new bloke at Potwell Inn, not a bit of it. See?" Uncle Jim was certainly not a handsome person. He was short, shorter than Mr. Polly, with long arms and lean big hands. A thin and wiry neck stuck out of his grey flannel shirt, and supported a big head that had something of the snake in the convergent lines of its broad knotty brow, meanly proportioned face and pointed chin. His almost toothless mouth seemed a cavern in the twilight. Some accident had left him with one small and active and one large and expressionless reddish eye, and wisps of straight hair strayed from under the blue cricket cap he wore pulled down obliquely over the latter. He spat between his teeth and wiped his mouth untidily with the soft side of his fist. "You got to blurry well shift," he said. "See?"
Shift?"
said Mr. Polly.
"How?"
"'Cause the Potwell Inn's my beat. See?" Mr. Polly had never felt less witty. "How's it your beat?" he asked. Uncle Jim thrust his face forward and shook his open hand, bent like a claw, under Mr. Polly's nose. "Not your blooming business," he said. "You got to shift." "Suppose I don't," said Mr. Polly. "You got to shift." The tone of Uncle Jim's voice became urgent and confidential. "You don't know who you're up against," he said. "It's a kindness I'm doing to warn you, see? I'm just one of these blokes who don't stick at things, see? I don't stick at nothing." Mr. Polly's manner became detached and confidential, as though the matter and the speaker interested him greatly, but didn't concern him overmuch. "What do you think you'll do?" he asked. "If you don't clear out?" "Yes." "Gaw!" said Uncle Jim. "You better. Here." He gripped Mr. Polly's wrist with a grip of steel, and in an instant Mr. Polly understood the relative quality of their muscles. He breathed an uninspiring breath into Mr. Polly's face. "What won't I do?" he said. "Once I start in on you." He paused, and the night about them seemed to be listening. "I'll make a mess of you," he said in his hoarse whisper. "I'll do you injuries. I'll hurt you. I'll kick you ugly, see? I'll hurt you in horrible ways, horrible ugly ways." He scrutinised Mr. Polly's face. "You'll cry," he said, "to see yourself. See? Cry you will." "You've got no right," began Mr. Polly. "Right?" His note was fierce. "Ain't the old woman me aunt?" He spoke still closer. "I'll make a gory mess of you. I'll cut bits off of you." He receded a little. "I've got no quarrel with you," he said. "It's too late to go tonight," said Mr. Polly. "I'll be round tomorrow, 'bout 11, see? And if I find you..." He produced a blood-curdling oath. "Hum," said Mr. Polly, trying to keep things light. "We'll consider your suggestions." "You better," said Uncle Jim, and suddenly, noiselessly, was going. His whispering voice sank until Mr. Polly could hear only the dim fragments of sentences. "Horrible things to you, horrible things. Kick you ugly, kick your liver out, spread it all about I will. Out in doos. See, I don't care a dead rat one way or the other." And with a curious twisting gesture of the arm, Uncle Jim receded until his face was a still, dim thing that watched, and the black shadows of the hedge seemed to have swallowed up his body altogether. End of section 2. Chapter 9, Section 3 of The History of Mr. Polly by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 9, Section 3. Next morning, about 10:30, Mr. Polly found himself seated under a clump of fir trees by the roadside, and about 3.5 miles from the Potwell Inn. He was by no means sure whether he was taking a walk to clear his mind or leaving that threat-marred paradise for good and all. His reason pointed a lean, unhesitating finger along the latter course. After all, the thing was not his quarrel. That agreeable plump woman, agreeable, motherly, comfortable as she might be, wasn't his affair. That child with the mop of black hair, who combined so magically the charm of mouse and butterfly and flitting bird, who was daintier than a flower and softer than a peach, was no concern of his. Good heavens, what were they to him? Nothing. Uncle Jim, of course, had a claim, a sort of claim. If it came to duty and chucking up this attractive, indolent, observant, humorous, tramping life, there were those who had a right to him, a legitimate right, a prior claim on his protection and chivalry. Why not listen to the call of duty and go back to Miriam now? He had had a very agreeable holiday. And while Mr. Polly sat thinking these things as well as he could, he knew that if only he dared to look up, the heavens had opened and a clear judgment on his case was written across the sky. He knew now as much as a man can know of life. He knew he had to fight or perish. Life had never been so clear to him before. It had always been a confused, entertaining spectacle. He had responded to this impulse and that, seeking agreeable and entertaining things, evading difficult and painful things. Such is the way of those who grow up to a life that has neither danger nor honour in its texture. He had been muddled and wrapped about and entangled like a creature born in the jungle who has never seen sea or sky. Now he had come out of it, suddenly, into a great exposed place. It was as if God and heaven waited over him and all the earth was expectation. "Not my business," said Mr. Polly, speaking aloud. "Where the devil do I come in?" And again, with something between a whine and a snarl in his voice, "Not my blasted business." His mind seemed to have divided itself into several compartments, each with its own particular discussion busily in progress, and quite regardless of the others. One was busy with the detailed interpretation of the phrase, "kick you ugly." There's a sort of French wrestling in which you use and guard against feet. Watch the man's eye, and as his foot comes up, grip and over he goes, at your mercy if you use the advantage right. But how do you use the advantage rightly? When he thought of Uncle Jim, the inside feeling of his body faded away rapidly into blank discomfort. Old cadger, she hadn't no business to drag me into her quarrels. Ought to go to the police and ask for help. Dragging me into a quarrel that don't concern me. Wish I've never set eyes on the rotten inn. The reality of the case arched over him like the vault of the sky, as plain as the sweet blue heavens above and the wide spread of hill and valley about him. Man comes into life to seek and find his sufficient beauty, to serve it, to win and increase it, to fight for it, to face anything and dare anything for it, counting death as nothing so long as the dying eyes still turn to it, and fear and dullness and indolence and appetite, which indeed are no more than fear's three crippled brothers who make ambushes and creep by night, are against him, to delay him, to hold him off, to hamper and beguile and kill him in that quest. He had but to lift his eyes to see all that, as much a part of his world as the driving clouds and the bending grass, But he had kept himself downcast, a grumbling, inglorious, dirty, fattish little tramp, full of dreads and quivering excuses. "Why the hell was I ever born?" he said, with the truth almost winning him. What do you do when a dirty man who smells gets you down and under in the dust and dirt with a knee below your diaphragm and a large hairy hand squeezing your windpipe tighter and tighter in a quarrel that isn't, properly speaking, yours? "If I had a chance against him," protested Mr. Polly. "It's no good, you see," said Mr. Polly. He stood up as though his decision was made, and was for an instant still struck by doubt. There lay the road before him, going this way to the east and that to the west. Westward, 1 hour away now, was the Potwell Inn. Already things might be happening there. Eastward was the wise man's course, a road dipping between hedges to a hop garden and a wood, and presently no doubt reaching an inn, a picturesque church perhaps, a village and fresh company. The wise man's course. Mr. Polly saw himself going along it, and tried to see himself going along it with all the self-applause a wise man feels. But somehow it wouldn't come like that. The wise man fell short of happiness for all his wisdom. The wise man had a paunch and round shoulders and red ears and excuses. It was a pleasant road, and why the wise man should not go along it merry and singing, full of summer happiness, was a miracle to Mr. Polly's mind. But confound it! The fact remained, the figure went slinking. Slinking was the only word for it, and would not go otherwise than slinking. He turned his eyes westward, as if for an explanation. And if the figure was no longer ignoble, the prospect was appalling. "One kick in the stomach would settle a chap like me," said Mr. Polly. "Oh God!" cried Mr. Polly, and lifted his eyes to heaven and said for the last time in that struggle, "It isn't my affair." And so saying he turned his face towards the Potwell Inn. He went back, neither halting nor hastening in his pace after this last decision, but with a mind feverishly busy. "If I get killed, I get killed, and if he gets killed, I get hung. Don't seem just somehow. Don't suppose I shall just frighten him off." The private war between Mr. Polly and Uncle Jim for the possession of the Potwell Inn fell naturally into 3 chief campaigns. There was, first of all, the great campaign which ended in the triumphant eviction of Uncle Jim from the inn premises. Then came next, after a brief interval, the futile invasions of the premises by Uncle Jim that culminated in the Battle of the Dead Eel, and after some months of involuntary truce there was the last supreme conflict of the Night's Surprise. Each of these campaigns merits a section to itself. Mr. Polly entered the inn discreetly. He found the plump woman seated in her bar, her eyes astare, her face white and wet with tears. "Oh God!" she was saying over and over again. "Oh God!" The air was full of a spirituous reek, and on the sanded boards in front of the bar were the fragments of a broken bottle and an overturned glass. She turned her despair at the sound of his entry, and despair gave place to astonishment. "You come back," she said. "Rather," said Mr. Polly. "He's mad drunk and looking for her." "Where is she?" "Locked upstairs." "Haven't you sent to the police?" "No one to send." "I'll see to it," said Mr. Polly. "Out this way?" She nodded. He went to the crinkly paned window and peered out. Uncle Jim was coming down the garden path towards the house, his hands in his pockets, singing hoarsely. Mr. Polly remembered afterwards with pride and amazement that he felt neither faint nor rigid. He glanced round him, seized a bottle of beer by the neck as an improvised club, and went out by the garden door. Uncle Jim stopped amazed. His brain did not instantly rise to the new posture of things. "You!" he cried, and stopped for a moment. "You! Scoot!" "Your job," said Mr. Polly, and advanced some paces. Uncle Jim stood swaying with wrathful astonishment, and then darted forward with clutching hands. Mr. Polly felt that if his antagonist closed he was lost, and smote with all his force at the ugly head before him. Smash went the bottle, and Uncle Jim staggered, half stunned by the blow and blinded with beer. The lapses and leaps of the human mind are forever mysterious. Mr. Polly had never expected that bottle to break. In the instant he felt disarmed and helpless. Before him was Uncle Jim, infuriated and evidently still coming on, and for defence was nothing but the neck of a bottle. For a time our Mr. Polly has figured heroic. Now comes the fall again. He sounded abject terror. He dropped that ineffectual scrap of glass and turned and fled round the corner of the house. "Bottles!" came the thick voice of the enemy behind him, as one who accepts a challenge, and bleeding but indomitable, Uncle Jim entered the house. "Bottles!" he said, surveying the bar. "Fighting with bottles! I'll show him fighting with bottles!" Uncle Jim had learned all about fighting with bottles in the reformatory home. Regardless of his terror-stricken aunt, he ranged among the bottled beers and succeeded after one or two failures in preparing 2 bottles to his satisfaction by knocking off the bottoms and gripping them dagger-wise by the necks. So prepared he went forth again to destroy Mr. Polly. Mr. Polly, freed from the sense of urgent pursuit, had halted behind the raspberry canes and rallied his courage. The sense of Uncle Jim victorious in the house restored his manhood. He went round by the outhouses to the riverside, seeking a weapon, and found an old paddle-boat hook. With this he smote Uncle Jim as he emerged by the door of the tap. Uncle Jim, blaspheming dreadfully and with dire stabbing intimations in either hand, came through the splintering paddle like a circus rider through a paper hoop, and once more Mr. Polly dropped his weapon and fled. A careless observer, watching him sprint round and round the inn in front of the lumbering and reproachful pursuit of Uncle Jim, might have formed an altogether erroneous estimate of the issue of the campaign. Certain compensating qualities of the very greatest military value were appearing in Mr. Polly even as he ran. If Uncle Jim had strength and brute courage and the rich toughening experience a reformatory home affords, Mr. Polly was nevertheless sober, more mobile, and with a mind now stimulated to an almost incredible nimbleness, so that he had not only gained on Uncle Jim, but thought what use he might make of his advantage. The word strategious flamed red across the tumult of his mind. As he came round the house for the 3rd time, he darted suddenly into the yard, swung the door to behind himself and bolted it, seized the zinc pig's pail that stood by the entrance to the kitchen, and had it neatly and resolutely over Uncle Jim's head as he came belatedly round the outhouse on the other side. One of the splintered bottles jabbed Mr. Polly's ear. At the time it seemed of no importance, and then Uncle Jim was down and writhing dangerously and noisily upon the yard tiles, with his head still in the pig pail and his bottles gone to splinters, and Mr. Polly was fastening the kitchen door against him. "Can't go on like this forever," said Mr. Polly, whooping for breath, and selecting a weapon from among the brooms that stood behind the kitchen door. Uncle Jim was losing his head. He was up and kicking the door and bellowing unamiable proposals and invitations, so that a strategist emerging silently by the tap door could locate him without difficulty, steal upon him unawares, and... But before that felling blow could be delivered, Uncle Jim's ear had caught a footfall, and he turned. Mr. Polly quailed and lowered his broom, a fatal hesitation. "Now I've got you!" cried Uncle Jim, dancing forward in a disconcerting zigzag. He rushed to close, and Mr. Polly stopped him neatly, as if it were a miracle, with the head of the broom across his chest. Uncle Jim seized the broom with both hands. "Let go," he said, and tugged. Mr. Polly shook his head, tugged, and showed pale compressed lips. Both tugged. Then Uncle Jim tried to get round the end of the broom. Mr. Polly circled away. They began to circle about one another, both tugging hard, both intensely watching for the slightest initiative on the part of the other. Mr. Polly wished brooms were longer, 12 or 13 feet for example. Uncle Jim was clearly for shortness in brooms. He wasted breath in saying what was to happen shortly, sanguinary, oriental soul-blenching things, when the broom no longer separated them. Mr. Polly thought he had never seen an uglier person. Suddenly Uncle Jim flashed into violent activity, but alcohol slows movement, and Mr. Polly was equal to him. Then Uncle Jim tried jerks, and for a terrible instant seemed to have the broom out of Mr. Polly's hands. But Mr. Polly recovered it with the clutch of a drowning man. Then Uncle Jim drove suddenly at Mr. Polly's midriff, but again Mr. Polly was ready and swept him round in a circle. Then suddenly a wild hope filled Mr. Polly. He saw the river was very near, the post to which the punt was tied not 3 yards away. With a wild yell he sent the broom home into his antagonist's ribs. "Whoosh!" he cried as the resistance gave. "Oh, Gor!" said Uncle Jim, going backwards helplessly, and Mr. Polly thrust hard and abandoned the broom to the enemy's despairing clutch. Splash! Uncle Jim was in the water, and Mr. Polly had leapt like a cat aboard the ferry punt and grasped the pole. Up came Uncle Jim, spluttering and dripping. "You!" Unprofitable matter, and printing it would lead to a censorship of novels. "You know I got a weak chest." The pole took him in the throat and drove him backward and downwards. "Let go!" cried Uncle Jim, staggering and with real terror in his once awful eyes. Splash! Down he fell backwards into a frothing mass of water, with Mr. Polly jabbing at him. Under water he turned round and came up again as if in flight towards the middle of the river. Directly his head reappeared, Mr. Polly had him between the shoulders and under again, bubbling thickly. A hand clutched and disappeared. It was stupendous. Mr. Polly had discovered the heel of Achilles. Uncle Jim had no stomach for cold water. The broom floated away, pitching gently on the swell. Mr. Polly, infuriated with victory, thrust Uncle Jim under again and drove the punt round on its chain in such a manner that when Uncle Jim came up for the 4th time, and now he was nearly out of his depth, too buoyed up to walk, and apparently nearly helpless, Mr. Polly, fortunately for them both, could not reach him. Uncle Jim made the clumsy gestures of those who struggle insecurely in the water. "Keep out!" said Mr. Polly. Uncle Jim, with a great effort, got a footing, emerged until his armpits were out of the water, until his waistcoat buttons showed one by one, till scarcely two remained, and made for the camp sheeting. "Keep out!" cried Mr. Polly, and leapt off the punt and followed the movement of his victim along the shore. "I tell you I've got a weak chest," said Uncle Jim moistly. "This ain't fair fighting," said Uncle Jim, almost weeping, and all his terrors had gone. "Keep out," said Mr. Polly, with an accurately poised pole. "I tell you I've got to land, you fool," said Uncle Jim, with a sort of despairing wrathfulness, and began moving downstream. "You keep out," said Mr. Polly in parallel movement. "Don't you ever land on this place again." Slowly, argumentatively and reluctantly, Uncle Jim waded downstream. He tried threats, he tried persuasion, he even tried a belated note of pathos. Mr. Polly remained inexorable, if in secret a little perplexed as to the outcome of the situation. "This cold's getting to my marrow," said Uncle Jim. "You want cooling. You keep out in it," said Mr. Polly. They came round the bend into sight of Nicholson's 8, where the backwater runs down to the Potwell Mill, and there, after much parley and several feints, Uncle Jim made a desperate effort and struggled into clutch of the overhanging osiers on the island, and so got out of the water with the mill stream between them. He emerged dripping and muddy and vindictive. "By Gor," he said, "I'll skin you for this." "You keep out or I'll do worse for you," said Mr. Polly. The spirit was out of Uncle Jim for the time, and he turned away to struggle through the osiers towards the mill, leaving a shining trail of water among the green-grey stems. Mr. Polly returned slowly and thoughtfully to the inn, and suddenly his mind began to bubble with phrases. The plump woman stood at the top of the steps that led up to the inn door to greet him.
"Law!"
she cried as he drew near.
"Hasn't he killed you?"
"Do I look like it?" said Mr. Polly.
"But where's Jim?"
"Gone off."
"He was mad drunk and dangerous."
"I put him in the river. That toned down his alkalaceous frenzy. I gave him a bit of a doing altogether."
"Hasn't he hurt you?"
"Not a bit of it."
"Then what's all that blood beside your ear?"
Mr. Polly felt. "Quite a cut. Funny how one overlooks things. Heated moments. He must have done that when he jabbed about with those bottles. Hello, Kiddy. You venturing downstairs again?"
"Ain't he killed you?"
asked the little girl.
"Well, I wish I'd seen more of the fighting."
"Didn't you?"
"All I saw was you running round the house and Uncle Jim after you."
There was a little pause. "I was leading him on," said Mr. Polly.
"Someone's shouting at the ferry," she said.
"Right-o. But you won't see any more of Uncle Jim for a bit. We've been having a bit of a conversazione about that."
"I believe it is Uncle Jim,"
said the little girl. "Then he can wait." He turned round and listened for the words that drifted across from the little figure on the opposite bank. So far as he could judge, Uncle Jim was making an appointment for the morrow. He replied with a defiant movement of the punt pole. The little figure was convulsed for a moment, and then went on its way upstream, fiercely. So it was that the first campaign ended in an insecure victory. End of section 3. Chapter 9, section 4 of The History of Mr. Polly by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 9, Section 4. The next day was Wednesday, and a slack day for the Potwell Inn. It was a hot, close day, full of the murmuring of bees. One or two people crossed by the ferry. An elaborately equipped fisherman stopped for cold meat and dry ginger ale in the bar parlour. Some haymakers came and drank beer for an hour, and afterwards sent jugs and jars by a boy to be replenished. That was all. Mr. Polly had risen early and was busy about the place meditating upon the probable tactics of Uncle Jim. He was no longer strung up to the desperate pitch of the first encounter, but he was grave and anxious. Uncle Jim had shrunken, as all antagonists that are boldly faced shrink, after the first battle, to the negotiable, the vulnerable. Formidable he was, no doubt, but not invincible. He had, under Providence, been defeated once, and he might be defeated altogether. Mr. Polly went about the place considering the militant possibilities of pacific things. Pokers, copper sticks, garden implements, kitchen knives, garden nets, barbed wire, oars, clotheslines, blankets, pewter pots, stockings and broken bottles. He prepared a club with a stocking and a bottle inside, upon the best East End model. He swung it round his head once, broke an outhouse window with a flying fragment of glass, and ruined the stocking beyond all darning. He developed a subtle scheme with the cellar flap as a sort of pitfall, but he rejected it finally because A, it might entrap the plump woman, and B, he had no use whatsoever for Uncle Jim in the cellar. He determined to wire the garden that evening, burglar fashion, against the possibilities of night attack. Towards 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 young men arrived in a capacious boat from the direction of Lamham, and asked permission to camp in the paddock. It was given all the more readily by Mr. Polly because he perceived in their proximity a possible check upon the self-expression of Uncle Jim. But he did not foresee, and no one could have foreseen, that Uncle Jim, stealing unawares upon the Potwell Inn in the late afternoon, armed with a large rough-hewn stake, should have mistaken the bending form of one of those campers, who was pulling a few onions by permission in the garden, for Mr. Polly, and crept upon it swiftly and silently, and smitten its wide invitation unforgettably and unforgivably. It was an error impossible to explain. The resounding whack went up to heaven, the cry of amazement, and Mr. Polly emerged from the inn armed with the frying pan he was cleaning, to take his reckless assailant in the rear. Uncle Jim, realizing his error, fled blaspheming into the arms of the other 2 campers, who were returning from the village with butcher's meat and groceries. They caught him. They smacked his face with steak and punched him with a bursting parcel of lump sugar. They held him, though he bit them, and their idea of punishment was to duck him. They were hilarious, strong young stockbrokers' clerks, territorials and seasoned boating men. They ducked him as though it was romping, and all that Mr. Polly had to do was to pick up lumps of sugar for them, and wipe them on his sleeve, and put them on a plate, and explain that Uncle Jim was a notorious bad character, and not quite right in the head. "Got a regular obsession that the missus is his aunt," said Mr. Polly, expanding it. "Perfect nuisance he is." But he caught a glance of Uncle Jim's eye as he receded before the camper's urgency that boded ill for him, and in the night he had a disagreeable idea that perhaps his luck might not hold for the 3rd occasion. That came soon enough. so soon indeed as the campus had gone. Thursday was the early closing day at Lamham, and next to Sunday the busiest part of the week at the Potwell Inn. Sometimes as many as 6 boats all at once would be moored against the ferry punt and hiring rowboats. People could either have a complete tea with jam, cake and eggs, a kettle of boiling water and find the rest, or refreshments à la carte, as they chose. They sat about, but usually the boiling waterers had a delicacy about using the tables and grouped themselves humbly on the ground. The complete tears with jam and eggs got the best tablecloth on the table nearest the steps that led up to the glass-panelled door. The groups about the lawn were very satisfying to Mr. Polly's sense of amenity. To the right were the complete tears with everything heart could desire, then a small group of 3 young men in remarkable green and violet and pale blue shirts, and 2 girls in mauve and yellow blouses, with common teas and gooseberry jam at the green clothless table. Then, on the grass down by the pollarded willow, a small family of hot waterers with a hamper, a little troubled by wasps in their jam, from the nest in the tree, and all in mourning, but happy otherwise. And on the lawn to the right, a ginger-beer lot of apprentices without their collars, and very jocular and happy. The young people in the rainbow shirts and blouses formed the centre of interest. They were under the leadership of a gold-spectacled senior with a fluting voice and an air of mystery. He ordered everything, and showed a particular knowledge of the qualities of the Potwell jams, preferring gooseberry with much insistence. Mr. Polly watched him, christened him the beneficous influence, glanced at the apprentices, and went inside and down into the cellar in order to replenish the stock of stone ginger beer, which the plump woman had allowed to run low during the preoccupations of the campaign. It was in the cellar that he first became aware of the return of Uncle Jim. He became aware of him as a voice not only hoarse but thick, as voices thicken under the influence of alcohol.
"Where's that muddy-faced mongrel?"
cried Uncle Jim.
"Let him come out to me. Where's that blighted wisp with the punt pole? I got a word to say to him. Come out of it, you pot-bellied chunk of dirtiness, you. Come out and have your ugly face wiped. I got a thing for you. Hear me?" "He's hiding, that's what he's doing," said the voice of Uncle Jim, dropping for a moment to sorrow, and then with a great increment of wrathfulness, "Come out of my nest, you blinking cuckoo, you, or I'll cut your silly insides out. Come out of it, you pock-marked rat, stealing another man's home away from him. Come out and look me in the face, you squinting son of a skunk."
Mr. Polly took the ginger beer and went thoughtfully upstairs to the bar.
"He's back,"
said the plump woman as he appeared.
"I knew he'd come back."
"I heard him," said Mr. Polly, and looked about. "Just give me the old poker handle that's under the beer engine." The door opened softly, and Mr. Polly turned quickly. But it was only the pointed nose and intelligent face of the young man with the gilt spectacles and discreet manner. He coughed, and the spectacles fixed Mr. Polly. "I say," he said with quiet earnestness, "there's a chap out here seems to want someone." "Why don't he come in?" said Mr. Polly. "He seems to want you out there." "What's he want?" "I think," said the spectacled young man after a thoughtful moment,
He appears to have brought you a present of fish. Isn't he shouting? He is a little boisterous. He'd better come in."
The manner of the spectacled young man intensified.
"I wish you'd come out and persuade him to go away," he said. "His language isn't quite the thing. Ladies." "It never was,"
said the plump woman, her voice charged with sorrow. Mr. Polly moved towards the door and stood with his hand on the handle. The gold-spectacled face disappeared.
"Now, my man," came his voice from outside, "be careful what you're saying." "Who in all the world and hereafter are you to call me my man?" cried Uncle Jim in the voice of one astonished and pained beyond endurance, and added scornfully, "You gold-eyed geezer, you!" "Tut, tut," said the gentleman in gilt glasses. "Restrain yourself." Mr. Polly emerged, poker in hand, just in time to see what followed. Uncle Jim, in his shirt-sleeves and a state of ferocious décolletage, was holding something, yes, a dead eel, by means of a piece of newspaper about its tail, holding it down and back and a little sideways, in such a way as to smite it upwards and hard. It struck the spectacled gentleman under the jaw with a peculiar dead thud, and a cry of horror came from the two seated parties at the sight. One of the girls shrieked piercingly, "Horace!" and everyone sprang up. The sense of helping numbers came to Mr. Polly's aid. "Drop it!" he cried, and came down the steps waving his poker and thrusting the spectacled gentleman before him as once heroes were wont to wield the ox-hide shield. Uncle Jim gave ground suddenly and trod upon the foot of a young man in a blue shirt, who immediately thrust at him violently with both hands. "Let go!" howled Uncle Jim. "That's the chap I'm looking for," and pressing the head of the spectacled gentleman aside, smote hard at Mr. Polly. But at the sight of this indignity inflicted upon the spectacled gentleman, a woman's heart was stirred, and a pink parasol drove hard and true at Uncle Jim's wiry neck, and at the same moment the young man in the blue shirt sought to collar him, and lost his grip again. "Suffragettes!" gasped Uncle Jim, with the ferule at his throat. "Everywhere!" and aimed a second, more successful blow at Mr. Polly. "Whoa!" said Mr. Polly. But now the jam and egg party was joining in the fray. A stout, yet still fairly able-bodied gentleman in black and white checks inquired, "What's the fellow up to? Ain't there no police here?" And it was evident that once more public opinion was rallying to the support of Mr. Polly. "Oh, come on then, all the lot of you!" cried Uncle Jim, and backing dexterously, whirled the eel round in a destructive circle. The pink sunshade was torn from the hand that gripped it, and whirled athwart the complete but unadorned tea-things on the green table. "Collar him! Someone get hold of his collar!" cried the gold-spectacled gentleman, coming out of the scrimmage, retreating up the steps to the inn door as if to rally his forces. "Stand clear, you blessed mantle ornaments!" cried Uncle Jim. "Stand clear!" and retired backing, staving off attack by means of the whirling eel. Mr. Polly, undeterred by a sense of grave damage done to his nose, pressed the attack in front. The two young men in violet and blue skirmished on Uncle Jim's flanks. The man in black and white checks sought still further outflanking possibilities, and two of the apprentice boys ran for oars. The gold-spectacled gentleman, as if inspired, came down the wooden steps again, seized the tablecloth of the jam and egg party, lugged it from under the crockery with inadequate precautions against breakage, and advanced with compressed lips, curious lateral crouching movements, swift flashings of his glasses, and a general suggestion of bullfighting in his pose and gestures. Uncle Jim was kept busy, and unable to plan his retreat with any strategic soundness. He was, moreover, manifestly a little nervous about the river in his rear. He gave ground in a curve, and so came right across the rapidly abandoned camp of the family in mourning, crunching a teacup under his heel, oversetting the teapot, and finally tripping backwards over the hamper. The eel flew out at a tangent from his hand and became a mere looping relic on the sward. "Hold him!" cried the gentleman in spectacles. "Collar him!" and, moving forward with extraordinary promptitude, wrapped the best tablecloth around Uncle Jim's arms and head. Mr. Polly grasped his purpose instantly. The man in checks was scarcely slower, and in another moment Uncle Jim was no more than a bundle of smothered blasphemy and a pair of wildly active legs. "Duck him!" panted Mr. Polly, holding on to the earthquake. "Best thing, duck him!" The bundle was convulsed by paroxysms of anger and protest. One boot got to the hamper and sent it 10 yards. "Go into the house for a clothesline, someone," said the gentleman in gold spectacles. "He'll get out of this in a moment." One of the apprentices ran. "Bird nets in the garden," shouted Mr. Polly. "In the garden." The apprentice was divided in his purpose, and then suddenly Uncle Jim collapsed and became a limp, dead-seeming thing under their hands. His arms were drawn inward, his legs bent up under his person, and so he lay. "Fainted," said the man in checks, relaxing his grip. "A fit, perhaps," said the man in spectacles. "Keep hold," said Mr. Polly. Too late, for suddenly Uncle Jim's arms and legs flew out like springs released. Mr. Polly was tumbled backwards and fell over the broken teapot and into the arms of the father in mourning. Something struck his head dazzlingly. In another second Uncle Jim was on his feet, and the tablecloth enshrouded the head of the man in checks. Uncle Jim manifestly considered he had done all that honour required of him, and against overwhelming numbers and the possibility of reiterated duckings, flight is no disgrace. Uncle Jim fled. Mr. Polly sat up after an interval of an indeterminate length among the ruins of an idyllic afternoon. Quite a lot of things seemed scattered and broken, but it was difficult to grasp it all at once. He stared between the legs of people. He became aware of a voice speaking slowly and complainingly. "Someone ought to pay for those tea things," said the father in mourning. "We didn't bring 'em here to be danced on, not by no manner of means." There followed an anxious peace for 3 days, and then a rough man in a blue jersey, in the intervals of trying to choke himself with bread and cheese and pickled onions, broke out abruptly into information. "Jim's been lagged again, missus," he said.
"What?" said the landlady. "Our Jim?"
"Your Jim," said the man, and after an absolutely necessary pause for swallowing, added, "stealing a hatchet." He did not speak for some moments, and then he replied to Mr. Polly's inquiries. "Yes, a hatchet, down Lammam way, night before last."
"What did he steal a hatchet for?"
asked the plump woman. "He said he wanted a hatchet." "I wonder what he wanted a hatchet for," said Mr. Polly thoughtfully. "I daresay he had a use for it," said the gentleman in the blue jersey, and he took a mouthful that amounted to conversational suicide. There was a prolonged pause in the little bar, and Mr. Polly did some rapid thinking. He went to the window and whistled. "I shall stick it," he whispered at last. "Hatchets or no hatchets." He turned to the man with the blue jersey when he thought him clear for speech again. "How much did you say they'd given him?" he asked. 3 months, said the man in the blue jersey, and refilled anxiously, as if alarmed at the momentary clearness of his voice. Those 3 months passed all too quickly. Months of sunshine and warmth, of varied novel exertion in the open air, of congenial experiences, of interest and wholesome food and successful digestion, months that browned Mr. Polly and hardened him, and saw the beginnings of his beard. Months marred only by one anxiety, an anxiety Mr. Polly did his utmost to suppress. The day of reckoning was never mentioned, it is true, by either the plump woman or himself, but the name of Uncle Jim was written in letters of glaring silence across their intercourse. As the term of that respite drew to an end, his anxiety increased, until at last it even trenched upon his well-earned sleep. He had some idea of buying a revolver. At last he compromised upon a small and very foul and dirty rook rifle, which he purchased in Lammam under the pretext of bird scaring, and loaded and carefully concealed under his bed from the plump woman's eye. September passed away. October came. And at last came that night in October whose happenings it is so difficult for a sympathetic historian to drag out of their proper nocturnal indistinctiveness into the clear, hard light of positive statement. A novelist should present characters, not vivisect them publicly. The best, the kindliest, if not the justest course, is surely to leave untold such things as Mr. Polly would manifestly have preferred untold. Mr. Polly had declared that when the cyclist discovered him he was seeking a weapon that should make a conclusive end to Uncle Jim. That declaration is placed before the reader without comment. The gun was certainly in possession of Uncle Jim at that time, and no human being but Mr. Polly knows how he got hold of it. The cyclist was a literary man named Warspite, who suffered from insomnia. He had risen and come out of his house near Lammam just before the dawn, and he discovered Mr. Polly partly concealed in the ditch by the Potwell churchyard wall. It is an ordinary dry ditch, full of nettles and overgrown with elder and dogrose, and in no way suggestive of an arsenal. It is the last place in which you would look for a gun. And he says that when he dismounted to see why Mr. Polly was allowing only the latter part of his person to show, and that it would seem by inadvertency, Mr. Polly merely raised his head and advised him to look out, and added, "He's let fly at me twice already." He came out under persuasion and with gestures of extreme caution. He was wearing a white cotton nightgown of the type that has now been so extensively superseded by pyjama sleeping suits, and his legs and feet were bare and much scratched and torn and very muddy. Mr. Warspite takes that exceptionally lively interest in his fellow creatures which constitutes so much of the distinctiveness and complex charm of your novelist all the world over, and he at once involved himself generously in the case. The two men returned at Mr. Polly's initiative across the churchyard to the Potwell Inn, and came upon the burst and damaged rook rifle near the new monument to Sir Samuel Harpon upon the corner by the yew. "That must have been his third go," said Mr. Polly. "It sounded a bit funny." The sight inspirited him greatly, and he explained further that he had fled to the churchyard on account of the cover afforded by the tombstones from the flight of small shot. He expressed anxiety for the fate of the landlady of the Potwell Inn and her grandchild, and led the way with enhanced alacrity along the lane to that establishment. They found the doors of the house standing open, the bar in some disorder, several bottles of whisky were afterwards found to be missing, and Blake, the village policeman, rapping patiently at the open door. He entered with them. The glass at the bar had suffered severely, and one of the mirrors was starred from a blow from a pewter pot. The till had been forced and ransacked, and so had the bureau in the minute room behind the bar. An upper window was opened, and the voice of the landlady became audible, making inquiries. They went out and parleyed with her. She had locked herself upstairs with the little girl, she said, and refused to descend until she was assured that neither Uncle Jim nor Mr. Polly's gun were anywhere on the premises. Mr. Blake and Mr. Warspite proceeded to satisfy themselves with regard to the former condition, and Mr. Polly went to his room in search of garments more suited to the brightening dawn. He returned immediately with a request that Mr. Blake and Mr. Warspite would just come and look. They found his apartment in a state of extraordinary confusion, the bedclothes in a ball in the corner, the drawers all open and ransacked, the chair broken, the lock of the door forced and broken, one door panel slightly scorched and perforated by shot, and the window wide open. None of Mr. Polly's clothes were to be seen, but some garments which had apparently once formed part of a stoker's workaday outfit, two brownish-yellow halves of a shirt, and an unsound pair of boots, were scattered on the floor. A faint smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, and 2 or 3 books Mr. Polly had recently acquired had been shied with some violence under the bed. Mr. Warspite looked at Mr. Blake, and then both men looked at Mr. Polly. "That's his boots," said Mr. Polly. Mr. Blake turned his eye to the window. "Some of these tiles have just got broken," he observed. "I got out of the window and slid down the scullery tiles," Mr. Polly answered, omitting much, they both felt, from his explanation. "Well, we better find him and have a word with him," said Blake. "That's about my business now." But Uncle Jim had gone altogether. He did not return for some days. That perhaps was not very wonderful. But the days lengthened to weeks, and the weeks to months, and still Uncle Jim did not reoccur. A year passed, and the anxiety of him became less acute. A second healing year followed the first. One afternoon, about 30 months after the night's surprise, the plump woman spoke of him. "I wonder what's become of Jim," she said. "I wonder sometimes," said Mr. Polly. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10, the last chapter of The History of Mr. Polly by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Chapter 10. Miriam Revisited. One summer afternoon, about 5 years after his first coming to the Potwell Inn, Mr. Polly found himself sitting under the pollard willow, fishing for dace. It was a plumper, browner, and healthier Mr. Polly altogether than the miserable bankrupt with whose dyspeptic portrait our novel opened. He was fat, but with a fatness more generally diffused, and the lower part of his face was touched to gravity by a small square beard. Also he was balder. It was the first time he had found leisure to fish, though from the very outset of his Potwell career he had promised himself abundant indulgence in the pleasure of fishing.
Fishing, as the golden page of English literature testifies, is a meditative and retrospective pursuit, and the varied page of memory, disregarded so long for sake of the teeming duties I have already enumerated, began to unfold itself to Mr. Polly's consideration. A speculation about Uncle Jim died for want of material, and gave place to a reckoning of the years and months that had passed since his coming to the Potwell, and that to a philosophical review of his life. He began to think about Miriam, remotely and impersonally. He remembered many things that had been neglected by his conscience during the busier times, as, for example, that he had committed arson and deserted a wife. For the first time he looked these long-neglected facts in the face. It is disagreeable to think one has committed arson, because it is an action that leads to jail. Otherwise I do not think there was a grain of regret for that in Mr. Polly's composition. But deserting Miriam was in a different category. Deserting Miriam was mean. This is a history and not a glorification of Mr. Polly, and I tell of things as they were with him. Apart from the disagreeable twinge arising from the thought of what might happen if he was found out, he had not the slightest remorse about that fire. Arson, after all, is an artificial crime. Some crimes are crimes in themselves, would be crimes without any law. The cruelties, mockery, and breaches of faith that astonish and wound. But the burning of things is in itself neither good nor bad. A large number of houses deserve to be burned, most modern furniture, an overwhelming majority of pictures and books. One might go on for some time with the list. If our community was collectively anything more than a feeble idiot, it would burn most of London and Chicago, for example, and build sane and beautiful cities in the place of these pestilential heaps of rotten private property. I have failed in presenting Mr. Polly altogether if I have not made you see that he was in many respects an artless child of nature, far more untrained, undisciplined and spontaneous than an ordinary savage. And he was really glad, for all that little drawback of fear, that he had the courage to set fire to his house and fly and come to the Potwell Inn. But he was not glad he had left Miriam. He had seen Miriam cry once or twice in his life, and it had always reduced him to abject commiseration. He now imagined her crying. He perceived in a perplexed way that he had made himself responsible for her life. He forgot how she had spoiled his own. He had hitherto rested in the faith that she had over £100 of insurance money, but now, with his eye meditatively upon his float, he realized £100 does not last forever. His conviction of her incompetence was unflinching. She was bound to have fooled it away somehow by this time. And then he saw her humping her shoulders and sniffing in a manner he had always regarded as detestable at close quarters, but which now became harrowingly pitiful. "Damn," said Mr. Polly, and down went his float, and he flicked up a victim to destruction and took it off the hook. He compared his own comfort and health with Miriam's imagined distress. "Ought to have done something for herself," said Mr. Polly, rebaiting his hook. "She was always talking about doing things. Why couldn't she?" He watched the float oscillating gently towards quiescence. "Silly to begin thinking about her," he said. "Damn silly." But once he had begun thinking about her, he had to go on. "Oh, blow!" cried Mr. Polly presently, and pulled up his hook to find another fish had just snatched at it in the last instant. His handling must have made the poor thing feel itself unwelcome. He gathered his things together and turned towards the house. All the Potwell Inn betrayed his influence now, for here indeed he had found his place in the world. It looked brighter, so bright indeed as to be almost skittish, with the white and green paint he had lavished on it. Even the garden palings were striped white and green, and so were the boats. For Mr. Polly was one of those who find a positive sensuous pleasure in the laying on of paint. Left and right were two large boards, which had done much to enhance the inn's popularity with the lighter-minded variety of pleasure-seekers. Both marked innovations. One bore in large words the single word museum. The other was plain and laconic with omelettes. The spelling of the latter word was Mr. Polly's own, but when he had seen a whole boatload of men intent on Lammam for lunch stop open-mouthed and stare and grin and come in and ask in a marked sarcastic manner for omelettes, he perceived that his inaccuracy had done more for the place than his utmost cunning could have contrived. In a year or so the inn was known both up and down the river by its new name of omelettes, and Mr. Polly, after some secret irritation, smiled and was content. And the fat woman's omelettes were things to remember. You will note I have changed her epithet. Time works upon us all. She stood upon the steps as he came towards the house and smiled at him richly.
"Caught many?"
she asked.
Got an idea," said Mr. Polly. "Would it put you out very much if I went off for a day or two for a bit of a holiday? There won't be much doing now until Thursday."
Feeling recklessly secure behind his beard, Mr. Polly surveyed the Fishbourne High Street once again. The north side was much as he had known it, except that Rusper had vanished. A row of new shops replaced the destruction of the great fire. Mantell and Throbson's had risen up again upon a more flamboyant pattern, and the new fire station was in the Swiss Teutonic style, and with much red paint. Next door, in the place of Rumbold's, was a branch of the Colonial Tea Company, and then a Salmon and Gluckstein tobacco shop, and then a little shop that displayed sweets and professed a tea-room upstairs. He considered this as a possible place in which to pursue inquiries about his lost wife, wavering a little between it and the God's Providence Inn down the street. Then his eye caught a name over the window. "Polly," he read, "and Larkins. Well, I'm astonished." A momentary faintness came upon him. He walked past and down the street, returned and surveyed the shop again. He saw a middle-aged, rather untidy woman standing behind the counter, who for an instant he thought might be Miriam, terribly changed, and then recognised as his sister-in-law, Annie, filled out and no longer hilarious. She stared at him without a sign of recognition as he entered the shop. "Can I have tea?" said Mr. Polly.
"Well," said Annie,
"You can, but our tea room's upstairs. My sister's been cleaning it out, and it's a bit upset."
"It would be," said Mr. Polly softly.
"I beg your pardon?"
said Annie.
"I said I didn't mind. Up here."
"I dare say there'll be a table,"
said Annie, and followed him to a room whose conscientious disorder
was intensely reminiscent of Miriam. "Nothing like turning everything upside down when you're cleaning," said Mr. Polly cheerfully. "It's my sister's way," said Annie impartially. "She's gone out for a bit of fresh air, but I dare say she'll be back soon to finish. It's a nice light room and it's tidy. Can I put you in a table over there?" "Let me," said Mr. Polly, and assisted. He sat down by the open window and drummed on the table and meditated on his next step while Annie vanished to get his tea. After all, things didn't seem so bad with Miriam. He tried over several gambits in imagination. "Unusual name," he said as Annie laid a cloth before him. Annie looked interrogation. "Polly and Larkins. Real, I suppose?" "Polly's my sister's name. She married a Mr. Polly." "Widow, I presume?" said Mr. Polly. "Yes, these 5 years, come October." "Lord!" said Mr. Polly in unfeigned surprise. "Found drowned he was. There was a lot of talk in the place." "Never heard of it," said Mr. Polly. "I'm a stranger, rather." "In the Medway, near Maidstone. He must have been in the water for days. Wouldn't have known him, my sister wouldn't, if it hadn't been for the name sewn in his clothes. All whitey and eat away he was." "Bless my heart, must have been a bit of a shock for her." "Oh, it was a shock," said Annie, and added darkly, "but sometimes a shock's better than a long agony." "No doubt," said Mr. Polly. He gazed with a rapt expression at the preparations before him. "So, I'm drowned," something was saying inside him. "Life insured?" he asked. "We started the tea rooms with it," said Annie. Why, if things were like this, had remorse and anxiety for Miriam been implanted in his soul? No shadow of an answer appeared. "Marriage is a lottery," said Mr. Polly. "She found it so," said Annie. "Would you like some jam?" "I'd like an egg," said Mr. Polly. "I'll have 2. I've got a sort of feeling as though I wanted keeping up. Wasn't a particularly good sort, this Mr. Polly." "He was a wearing husband," said Annie. "I've often pitied my sister. He was one of that sort." "Dissolute," suggested Mr. Polly faintly. "No," said Annie judiciously. "Not exactly dissolute. Feeble's more the word. Weak. He was weak as water." "How long do you want your eggs boiled?" 4 minutes exactly," said Mr. Polly. "One gets talking," said Annie. "One does," said Mr. Polly, and she left him to his thoughts. What perplexed him was his recent remorse and tenderness for Miriam. Now he was back in her atmosphere, all that had vanished, and the old feeling of helpless antagonism returned. He surveyed the piled furniture, the economically managed carpet, the unpleasing pictures on the wall. Why had he felt remorse? Why had he entertained this illusion of a helpless woman crying aloud in the pitiless darkness for him? He peered into the unfathomable mysteries of the heart and ducked back to a smaller issue. Was he feeble? The eggs came up. Nothing in Annie's manner invited a resumption of the discussion. "Business brisk?" he ventured to ask. Annie reflected. "It is," she said, "and it isn't. It's like that." "Oh," said Mr. Polly, and squared himself to his egg. "Was there an inquest on that chap?" "What chap?" "What was his name? Polly." "Of course." "You're sure it was him?" What do you mean?" Annie looked at him hard, and suddenly his soul was black with terror. "Who else could it have been in the very clothes he wore?" "Of course," said Mr. Polly, and began his egg. He was so agitated that he only realised its condition when he was halfway through it, and Annie safely downstairs. "Lord," he said, reaching out hastily for the pepper. "One of Miriam's. I haven't tasted such an egg for 5 years. Wonder where she gets them. Picks them out, I suppose." He abandoned it for its fellow. Except for a slight mustiness, the second egg was very palatable indeed. He was getting on down to the bottom of it, as Miriam came in. He looked up. "Nice afternoon," he said at her stare, and perceived she knew him at once by the gesture and the voice. She went white and shut the door behind her. She looked as though she was going to faint. Mr. Polly sprang up quickly and handed her a chair. "My God!" she whispered, and crumpled up rather than sat down. "It's you!" she said. "No," said Mr. Polly very earnestly. "It isn't. It just looks like me, that's all." "I knew that man wasn't you, all along. I tried to think it was. I tried to think that perhaps the water had altered your wrists and feet and the colour of your hair." "Oh." "I'd always feared you'd come back." Mr. Polly sat down by his egg. "I haven't come back," he said very earnestly. "Don't you think it." "How we pay the insurance now, I don't know." She was weeping. She produced a handkerchief and covered her face. "Look here, Miriam," said Mr. Polly. "I haven't come back, and I'm not coming back. I'm a visitant from another world. You shut up about me, and I'll shut up about myself. I came back because I thought you might be hard up, or in trouble, or some silly thing like that. Now I see you again, I'm satisfied. I'm satisfied completely, see? I'm going to absquatulate, see? Hey presto, right away." He turned to his tea for a moment, finished his cup noisily, stood up. "Don't you think you're going to see me again," he said, "for you ain't." He moved to the door. "That was a tasty egg," he said, hovered for a second, and vanished. Annie was in the shop. "The missus has had a bit of a shock," he remarked. "Got some kind of fancy about a ghost. Can't make it out quite. So long." And he had gone. Mr. Polly sat beside the fat woman at one of the little green tables at the back of the Potwell Inn, and struggled with the mystery of life. It was one of those evenings, serenely luminous, amply and atmospherically still, when the river bend was at its best. A swan floated against the dark green masses of the further bank. The stream flowed broad and shining to its destiny with scarce a ripple, except where the reeds came out from the headland, and the 3 poplars rose clear and harmonious against a sky of green and yellow, and it was as if it were all secure within a great warm friendly globe of crystal sky. It was as safe and enclosed and fearless as a child that has still to be born. It was an evening full of the quality of tranquil, unqualified assurance. Mr. Polly's mind was filled with the persuasion that indeed all things whatsoever must needs be satisfying and complete. It was incredible that life has ever done more than seemed to jar, that there could be any shadow in life save such velvet softness as made the setting for that silent swan, or any murmur but the ripple of the water as it swirled round the chained and gently swaying punt.
And the mind of Mr. Polly, exalted and made tender by this atmosphere, sought gently, but sought, to draw together the various memories that came drifting, half submerged, across the circle of his mind. He spoke in words that seemed like a bent and broken stick thrust suddenly into water, destroying the mirror of the shapes they sought. "Jim's not coming back again, ever," he said. "He got drowned 5 years ago." "Where?" asked the fat woman, surprised. "Miles from here, in the Medway, away in Kent." "Law!" said the fat woman. "It's right enough," said Mr. Polly. "How d'you know?" "I went to my home." "Where?" "Don't matter. I went and found out. He'd been in the water some days. He'd got my clothes and they said it was me." "They?" It don't matter. I'm not going back to them." The fat woman regarded him silently for some time. Her expression of scrutiny gave way to a quiet satisfaction. Then her brown eyes went to the river. "Poor Jim," she said. "He hadn't much tact, ever," she added mildly. "I can't hardly say I'm sorry." "Nor me," said Mr. Polly, and got a step nearer the thought in him. "But it don't seem much good his having been alive, does it?" "He wasn't much good," the fat woman admitted, "ever." "I suppose there were things that were good to him," Mr. Polly speculated. "They weren't our things." His hold slipped again. "I often wonder about life," he said weakly. He tried again. "One seems to start in life," he said, "expecting something, and it doesn't happen, and it doesn't matter. One starts with ideas that things are good and things are bad, and it hasn't much relation to what is good and what is bad. I've always been the skeptaceous sort, and it's always seemed rot to me to pretend that we know good from evil. It's just what I've never done. No Adam's apple stuck in my throat, ma'am. I don't own to it." He reflected. "I set fire to a house once." The fat woman started. "I don't feel sorry for it. I don't believe it was a bad thing to do, any more than burning a toy, like I did once when I was a baby. I nearly killed myself with a razor. Who hasn't, anyhow, gone as far as thinking of it? Most of my time I've been half dreaming. I married like a dream, almost. I've never really planned my life or set out to live. I happened. Things just happened to me. It's so with everyone. Jim couldn't help himself. I shot at him and tried to kill him. I dropped the gun and he got it. He very nearly had me. I wasn't a second too soon, ducking. Awkward that night was. But I don't blame him, come to that. Only I don't see what it's all up to. Like children playing about in a nursery, hurt themselves at times. There's something that doesn't mind us," he resumed presently. "It isn't what we try to get that we get. It isn't the good we think we do is good. What makes us happy isn't our trying. What makes others happy isn't our trying. There's a sort of character people like and stand up for, and a sort they won't. You've got to work it out and take the consequences. Miriam was always trying." "Who's Miriam?" asked the fat woman. "Oh, no one you know, but she used to go about with her brows knit, trying not to do whatever she wanted to do, if ever she did want to do anything." He lost himself. "You can't help being fat," said the fat woman after a pause,
trying to get up to his thoughts. "You can't," said Mr. Polly. "It helps and it hinders." "Like my upside-down way of talking." "The magistrates wouldn't have kept on the licence to me if I hadn't been fat." "Then what would we have done," said Mr. Polly, "to get an evening like this? Lord, look at it!" He sent his arm round the great curve of the sky. "If I was a black or an Italian, I should come out here and sing. I whistle sometimes, but bless you, it's singing I've got in my mind. Sometimes I think I live for sunsets." "I don't see that it does you any good always looking at sunsets like you do," said the fat woman. "Nor me, but I do. Sunsets and things I was made to like." "They don't help you," said the fat woman thoughtfully. "Who cares?" said Mr. Polly. A deeper strain had come to the fat woman. "You got to die some day," she said. "Some things I can't believe," said Mr. Polly suddenly, "and one is your being a skellington." He pointed his hand towards the neighbour's hedge. "Look at 'em against the yellow, and they're just stinging nettles, nasty weeds, if you count things by their uses, and no help in the life hereafter. But just look at the look of 'em." "It isn't only looks," said the fat woman. "Whenever there's signs of a good sunset and I'm not too busy," said Mr. Polly, "I'll come and sit out here." The fat woman looked at him with eyes in which contentment struggled with some obscure, reluctant protest, and at last turned them slowly to the black nettle pagodas against the golden sky. "I wish we could," she said. "I will." The fat woman's voice sank nearly to the inaudible. "Not always," she said. Mr. Polly was some time before he replied. "Come here always when I'm a ghost," he replied. "Spoil the place for others," said the fat woman, abandoning her moral solicitudes for a more congenial point of view. "Not my sort of ghost wouldn't," said Mr. Polly, emerging from another long pause. "I'd be a sort of diaphanous feeling, just mellowish and warmish like." They said no more, but sat on in the warm twilight until at last they could scarcely distinguish each other's faces. They were not so much thinking as lost in a smooth, still quiet of the mind. A bat flitted by. "Time we was going in, old party," said Mr. Polly, standing up. "Supper to get. It's as you say, we can't sit here for ever." The end. End of chapter 9 and end of The History of Mr. Polly by H.G. Wells, read by Adrian Praetzellis in Santa Rosa, California, December 24th, 2011.